What's up, y'all? Today I'm bringing you guys another tier list that should help you guys break into Emerald for the next split for low elo. So if you're gold or below Emerald for next split, this is a tier list for mid lane that I believe is best for learning and improving. So this isn't like a win rate tier list, right? This isn't the champion that's strongest in the meta. If you want one of those, you can just look it up on LOLalytics or u.gg. They give good tier lists and they just show you the win rate. But I'm going to go through and I'm going to explain every one of these placements, and I'm going to explain why they're good for teaching you the game and why they're good for getting you a good foundation as you climb up through bronze, silver, gold, and platinum up into emerald. I have grouped these champions, and you can kind of see like the different highlighting just means a different group, and that's how I'm going to kind of talk about these so we can get through this video and keep it relatively quick. So the S tier, all of these champions are actually the same style of champion. They are burst mages, and their goal is to take good roams, solo kill their lane opponent, and move with their jungler. So, you know, it's your job to get your jungle ahead. It's your job to get lots of good roam opportunities. And it's a very simple play style. And these champions are all very easy to execute, right? Annie, Lysandra, and Vex. And so it's very easy. Poke down your lane opponent in lane. Set up a solo kill if you must. If you can't, then you roam with your jungler. And then you roam on the strong side. You get the objectives, that kind of thing. So this is a very good way to learn mid lane because it teaches you how to trade in lane, but it also teaches you how to roam and how to look at the map. And as a mid laner, that's what's really important, right? We're in the middle of the map. We are closest to all the laners. We are closest to our jungler. So it's really important we learn the value of roaming and leaving and understanding the value of a wave versus a roam, or an objective versus a wave, or whatever it may be. So those guys are S tier. The reason I have Nico in A tier, she actually plays very similar to the S tier guys, but she's a little bit harder. Actually, that's it. She's just a little bit harder. She's a little bit more complicated. So if you like Nico, still a great option to pick, still a good play style to know. Just a little bit more complicated. Next up in A tier are these AD marksmen, Auction and Tristana. Both of these champions, they have a very similar play style to the burst mages. However, you're not going to learn like how to use your mana efficiently. You're not going to learn some of the same things that you would learn playing a mage. So I think they're almost like playing on easy mode, but in a bad way, because you're like playing on easy mode, but you're not going to get punished for bad laning necessarily. So your laning's not going to be able to transition as easily to some other mages. Maybe later on down the line, you want to pick up some of these harder champions in C tier. They're not great for that, but they're still great for teaching you like how to shove, how to get solo kills, how to roam. They're still very solid. And if you want an AD pick, I highly recommend picking one of these guys up. Next up, we have the easy assassins. These assassins are the easiest that you can get. You have Diana, you have Fizz, you have Talon. So these three, they're all a little bit different. So they take the assassin playstyle, but they kind of shifted a little bit through one of their own ways. Like Talon, he's unique because he spikes at level 2. So he's the earliest game of the three. And he comes online really early and he takes lots of roams. And if you can keep that up, that's how you win. Diana, she's a little bit slower, a little bit tankier. She's a little bit more on the bruisery side. So you're kind of like the anti-melee, more of a teamfight ult kind of thing. And Fizz, he's kind of in the middle. He's the power spiking. You know, he's really strong at level 3. He's really strong at level 6. He's really strong on his mythic. But in between, he's maybe a little bit weaker. Now, the reason these easy assassins are in A tier is because they're basically more extreme versions of the burst mages. So burst mages, they kind of have a little bit of everything. A little bit of range, a little bit of wave clear, a little bit of roam potential, which gives you a very good kind of well-rounded view of mid lane. These guys are a little bit more extreme. They don't have the wave clear, so you have to get a little bit more creative with how you earn your roams. But it's a very similar idea. These guys are a solid A tier pick. If you're looking to play an assassin and you can handle playing one of these guys, I highly recommend it. For the last in A tier, we have Garen and Lux. The reason I have these guys on the end and categorized together is because they're both kind of unique. Lux is the easiest thing to get into if you want to learn how to play like poke mages, or if you want to get into control mages later on in the line. Lux will teach you how to dominate a lane very well. She'll teach you how to poke very hard. She'll teach you how to use efficient spells, be efficient with your mana usage. She'll teach you how to take control of the map without necessarily roaming. So that's why Lux is different. Garen is also very unique. He's another good pick that I recommend if you have, if you want an AD champion in your pool. And he's very simple and he's very good for climbing through low elo. However, he's very unique. So that's why I have him at the bottom of A tier here. he will teach you good macro, but he won't teach you the mechanics of playing other mid lane champions, right? He doesn't have mana. He doesn't have any of these other things. So I highly recommend him. However, he is a little bit unique. It's a bit of an acquired taste. On to B tier. So S and A tier are all amazing champions. If somebody comes to me playing an S or an A tier champion, I'm like, sweet, you're going to be easy to coach. You're going to be easy to talk to. And the journey should be it should be easier. For the B and C and situational tier champions, it's a little bit more complicated. Basically, the B tier champions you can find what these champions do, but easier or simpler in a higher tier, but they're still good. So let's take Ahri, for example. Ahri and Anivia actually are both very good examples. These two champions are very strong in low elo. So if you're good at them, you can have a very high win rate going through low elo playing Ahri and Anivia. However, they are kind of a little bit more complicated. You know, for Annie and Lissandra and Vex, these S tier champions, it's as simple as shove and roam. For Ahri and Anivia, you have some harder spells to land. You have a little bit more gray area. You don't have as much like clear defined spells. So they're a little bit more complicated to pick up and to learn. But when you learn them, they are still very solid champions. Tryndamere is the same way. He's basically Garen, but a little bit more complicated with a little bit more unique game plan. You know, Tryndamere is easy mechanically, but he's a lot harder to understand how to actually gain leads. He is a good champion if you are good at him in the mid lane, but he's a little bit tricky to pick up and he's very unique. Moving on to these two guys I have in purple, Aurelion Sol and Echo. These guys, the reason that I put them in B tier is because they're scaling champions. They're probably the easiest of the scaling champions, which is why they're as high as B tier. However, scaling champions are bad for learning the game, generally speaking, because they teach you to be very passive, they teach you to be reactive, and you give away a lot of your agency in the game early game, which in solo queue, early game matters the most. So if you're playing a scaling champion, it doesn't fit that well. However, Aurelion Sol and Echo are still very good for carrying low elo. These champions are very solid. You may learn some bad habits from being too passive early game, which you'll have to break out of when you start to play other champions, but they're still solid. Next, we have these kind of orange champions, Zoe, Yone, and Rumble. These champions are all good. They're good champions, but they're hard mechanically. They're kind of hard to get a feel for. Rumble's melee, so, you know, maybe he's a little bit too situational. Yone's has a lot of mechanics. Zoe has a lot of mechanics. So they're great if you already know how to play them or if you've already spent the time. But to learn them, you'll have to spend a lot of extra time and they're kind of extra complicated. Morgana, she's kind of in the same spot as Lux. She's very simple. She's very good. The reason that I put Morgana in B and not up in A with Lux is because not very many people play her mid lane. So you can't find resources as easily, right? And that's a big part when you're learning. You want to be able to find streamers. You want to be able to find one tricks. You want to be able to find guides. For Morgana mid, it's going to be tough to find guides. However, like if you're in my academy or if you're getting coaching group somebody, or if you're getting help, she's a phenomenal champion to climb with. She deserves A tier if you have the resources, but she doesn't. It's kind of tricky to find the resources. So now we're getting into C tier. C tier is a little bit complicated, and that honestly, that's what C should stand for, is complicated. These champions are not ideal, and for any champion that's in C tier, you should probably play a champion that's higher if you can handle it. However, you can still climb on the C tier champions, of course. It's just going to be harder and your climb will be a little bit longer, generally speaking. The first category here is just the control mages. Syndra, Victor, Azir, and Orianna. Now, the issue with control mages is their game plan is so fluid. Their game plan changes based on your jungle and the enemy jungle and the side lanes and the matchups, because they scale well, but they don't scale better than some champions. They don't roam well, but they roam better than other champions. They lane bully, but they don't have as much kill threat. So they're very complicated, and they're kind of the jack of all trades of mid lane. And when you know what you have to kind of specialize in a game, these guys could be very powerful. However, learning what you kind of need to do each game from a game-by-game basis is incredibly complicated and almost impossible if you're below platinum, if you're below diamond, next split if you're below emerald. So I would recommend staying away from these guys until, you know, right now I say platinum 2 or diamond. Next split, that'll be like emerald rank-ish. So be careful with the control mages. They're incredibly complicated, as well as their mechanics being incredibly complicated because they have a lot to do with spacing and maximizing their range. So you wouldn't think that they have the hardest mechanics, but they do. Mechanically speaking, they require the best clicks, the best movement, the best dodges out of any champion in mid lane. So very tough champions. Next, I have the unique mages. Cassiopeia, Ryze, Vel'Koz. These guys are so niche. They're very unique and they're hard to play. Right? Cassio is very hard. Ryze is complicated. You know, he's not that hard to do the combos on, but he's complicated. And then Vel'Koz, of course, has the crazy skill shots and the geometry. They're just complicated. You know, I'd rather have somebody play these champions than a control mage, to be honest. But they're just tough. You know, why would you do that to yourself? If you want to play Vel'Koz, like, just play Lux. If you want to play Ryze, just play, like, Lissandra. Because Lissandra is just, like, a better version of Ryze for low elo. If you want to play Cassiopeia, play a disengaged champion. Play Vex. Right? It's that simple. I don't know why you would do that to yourself to play these hard champions until you're in, you know, Diamond, and it starts to matter a little bit more about the actual kind of strength of these champions. Ryze and Vel'Koz are also just not good in the meta right now. At least Cassio is good in the meta. But, you know, it is what it is. Now, these green champions, I'm calling all of these guys the complicated assassins. Basically, they're champions that are very hard to execute correctly, and you're going to spend a lot of time kind of fighting the controls. I call it fighting the controller rather than fighting the game. If you play these champions, you're going to waste a lot of time, or maybe not waste, I'll say spend a lot of time learning the mechanics and learning how to control your champion, where you could just be, you know, playing Talon or Fizz, not having to deal with the complicated mechanics and just like winning more games and then getting to a higher elo and then attacking the other champions like Sylas or Akali. These champions like Sylas and Akali, they also have lots of options, which makes them more complicated. You know, for Fizz, it's like you have to solo kill your lane opponent and then you have to spread that lead by roaming. But for Sylas, like, maybe you can scale a little bit. You know, Akali, maybe you can scale a little bit. Maybe you can play team fights. You have all these different potential builds. It's just complicated to know what to do and when. And then on top of it being hard to do, it's hard to know why to do what to do, right? So all of these hard assassins, again, you can make it work, but I would highly recommend staying away from these champions if you can handle it until you're in a much higher elo, like Diamond Plus. Now, these purple champions, these are all just scalers. They just scale, and I mentioned earlier, scaling champions do not work well in solo queue. We have Corki, Vladimir, Kayle, Talia. They both play very passive. You're going to learn bad habits. If you play these champions, you're going to be too passive. You're not going to know how to take control of games early, which is what matters for solo queue. And you're going to be at the mercy of your teammates more often than people who choose to play other champions. So if you want to play a scaler, you know, play Asol. He's probably the simplest one. You can still do a little bit of things early. Still have a little bit of roam potential with the W. Or Echo, maybe. But otherwise, I don't recommend it. It's maybe a bit too situational. Now, this situational tier, these are champions that I believe are good in certain games, but you should not one-trick them. So like Galio, he's a good pick to match a high-paced team, to match a high-threat jungle. You know, maybe you have a Lee Sin and you want to 2v2 with him a lot. He's good for that. He's good for countering burst mages. You know, maybe the enemy picked Annie or Lissandra, and you normally play Annie or Lissandra. Then you can pick Galio, right, as a counter. It's a good situational counter to kind of add into your pool. Kassadin's similar, right? He counters mages, and he fits slow-paced games. Veigar, he's a scaler. That's kind of good for if you have a disengaged team. So maybe you have a Xayah bot lane or an Aphelios bot lane, and you have like a tank jungle, and you just want to play slow and farm it out. Veigar's good for that. But again, you probably shouldn't one-trick Veigar for the same reason you shouldn't one-trick these other scaling champions. Malzahar's good as a shutdown champion, right? You know, maybe they pick Kog'Maw ADC and they play like 4 supports, right? They play kind of a supporty mid lane. They play a tank jungle. They play, I don't know, like a tank top lane. They play an enchanter bot lane. Malzahar's very good at shutting that kind of comp down. He's also very good as a counter pick in some games, but you don't want to be just slamming Malzahar every game. Karma's the same way. Karma has a lot of very good pairings. She's a very good supporty champion. If your main champions get picked away and you're like, okay, I'm just going to be the support for my Kindred jungle, I'm going to be the support for my Lee Sin jungle, Karma's a good pick in that situation to add to your pool. So these situational guys, I would not recommend blind picking these guys or playing them all the time, but they're good things to look into if you're like, I like where my champion pool's at, but I just want an extra little sauce in some of these games, an extra little pocket pick or two. I think these are good looks. So this is my tier list for improving and climbing in mid lane. Again, it's not a win rate tier list. It's an improvement tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you guys in the next video. Y'all have a good one. Peace.